Yeah.
So welcome everybody to the first UCLIC research seminar for this academic year. I was going to say 2023, but we're a couple of months into 2023 now. So today we are pleased to have Peter come and present his research to us today. He's come all the way from King's College.
It's very far.
Yeah.
It's a dreadful journey. Don't do it ever.
We're excited to have him with us today, and I'll just kick the time straight over to you. And at the end,
sounds good.
If you have any questions for Peter about his research or about his life in general, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer those.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Well, it's great to be back because I've done my postdoc at UCL and UCLIC specifically. So I still have the muscle memory of trying to pull out my card when I get to the second floor and try and open the door, and then my card doesn't work. So I'm Peter. I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done over the last 3 years or so, and potentially a little bit further. That was supported by a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. And I've used this talk as a forcing function to really think more about what's the big story of what we're doing and why are we doing this, rather than just give you a series of, well, this study did this and this study did that, and so on. Duncan had told me that ideally I should keep to 30 minutes. And I was like, yes, I'll totally do that. And then I got a little too excited about all the things that I should or want to be talking about. So we'll see. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions, but here we go. So the whole point for me today is that I want to talk about these three assertions or things that essentially guide most of the research that we do. So one of these is that we're talking about these historical assumptions that tend to be baked into mental health interventions. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But essentially, there are things that people don't think about anymore because they've just been around for 20, 30 years, and therefore they're not considered a problem, but actually we could do a lot about. So if that's true, then the implication is that, as user-centered design, without having to do new psychology research or develop fundamentally new things psychologically, we can think about providing people with fundamentally different mechanisms of how you could think about building and deploying and developing mental health interventions, because we might be able to identify and question these assumptions. And often these questions and assumptions are leading to really interesting socio-technical problems that need new interaction design techniques. So it's not just we're doing this in service of psychology, we're actually addressing some pretty interesting HCI questions too. And then finally, that we're seeing that this general approach of trying to identify assumptions, then breaking them to little pieces, seems to be potentially helpful beyond, say, leading to Purrble, but seems to be helpful across a lot of things. So these are kind of the three main things that I want to talk about. We'll see how far we get. And the way that I specifically tried to structure this was a little bit about the fellowship as a way of motivating, there should be baked in assumptions that we should even look at, and what kind do we want to look for first. Second one, there's this little thing that's out there that has come out of my postdoc fellowship, and now it's being just available to be bought on Amazon, and I have no financial stake in it, which is great because I still get to do research on it. If anyone wants to, just go and grab one. And then maybe if we get to it, there's some notion of, hey, this is how we've replicated that process in a lot of other places now and why it seems interesting. So talking about the first point, what do we mean when we say about baked in historical or reified assumptions? And for us, the notion is that we really want to look into the theory of change. So every mental health intervention has a way of talking about the steps, the experience, the things that people need to go through for that intervention to be powerful, to be effective, right? So what we want to look at how people think about these theories of change, and what are the assumptions that they're making about what people are doing or are supposed to be doing, and where can support be offered? Because often it's about the things where people have given up on offering support for a particular piece, where you'll find the interesting assumptions that we can quite easily challenge with technology. So what I want to do here is, if you think about a traditional CBT, I'm going to give you a little bit of a sketch of how that's it's not necessarily a theory of change, but it's the process of how learning happens for any single construct, whether that's self-compassion or the ability to believe that I'm lovable or whatever else you want. this is the traditional model, canonical rough model that you might have as an everything. So you have something with a therapist, they tell you stuff, so they kind of try and offload some content to your brain. Ideally, you get an insight. It's something that's like, oh, aha moment, I see the world differently now. Then you might role play with the therapist about how to deal with this, situation where you feel that you're blushing. You might be given homework, because even therapists like homework. And then you're supposed to practice and apply this to your life. And then eventually you take it back to the therapist and you're like, well, this hasn't worked. What do we do? And the cycle repeats. Or like, hooray, you've finished and everything's great and you've learned that concept. Now, in the traditional model, there's a lot of work that kind of goes into thinking about how should we structure the session, right? How should we gain the insight? What exactly should the therapist say? What is the way that we role play? The homeworks have gotten a lot of work, but actually in that you need to try it out and practice and then learn how that skill works. That is where no support's really offered pretty much, because traditionally either you would send the therapist home with the patient, or you try to call them, or you'd get someone else who's trained to go behind the patient and like try and help them. So that was one of the assumptions where this hasn't worked. Now, if you look at the more modern version of CBT, it's more or less the same, right? You have psychoeducation, you have an insight, you have role play, you have workshop or notifications. And again, these pieces, the interaction design support for you trying to learn how to apply cognitive reappraisal to the thought that you have because you now see something on TikTok that just makes you feel really uncomfortable, that doesn't really happen, or at least too much. There's a bunch of papers where we're saying this is kind of true, and we can talk about those in questions. So the Future Leaders Fellowship essentially said, hey, if this is the piece that is really unsupported, this is potentially a really good place to look for assumptions that kind of don't make any sense anymore. They've just been left there for a long time when the only thing that people could use in therapy was a recorder and videotape, VHS, whatever it was. And what we want to do is really design and test new technology-enabled approaches, so stuff that is now possible, reasonably novel technology, that will provide ongoing and contextualized support, which is going towards the notion of this is skill development. We need to help people practice these skills. And we assume that the place where most kind of lower hanging fruit is when we're supporting people in their daily moments, right? This is the place where we haven't really looked into with the therapists. So then if you look at this diagram, and it's going to be coming up all the time, it essentially just says to be able to do this, you need to be able to take the psychological mechanism. So essentially take a psychological intervention, CBT, decompose it to the components of what it's actually supposed to do to someone's brain, and then apply your design thinking and recompose it in something very different potentially than what the therapists are working with, even though the psychology, the theory of change is very much the same. You need to know what is it that they do, like where do people use it? If you're talking about delivering into everyday settings, socio-technical in the wild research becomes really important and really hard. And then there's some, the traditional technical stuff of what can we do? How do we design it? What are the interaction design patterns? So the fellowship itself was saying, okay, this is the interesting area. Let's look at two aspects, emotion regulation and parenting, because those are interesting for various reasons. Both of those are transdiagnostic factors. So essentially, if you solve emotion regulation supports, you've solved it for CBT, DBT, ACT, lots of preventative interventions too, and essentially you've helped people who have behavioral dysregulation as children, people who are suicidal, people who have eating disorders. It's just a very wide-ranging concept. The same for parenting. And just to flag up, most of the work that I talk about is not my own per se. It's been done with lots of amazing researchers, both at King's, some of whom will be kind of joining us later today in the evening, as well as a bunch of mostly clinicians elsewhere who I needed to kind of make sure that if I'm talking about clinical interventions doing something that they tell me I'm wrong, and we get to it. Okay, so this is the boring theory, and now becomes the boring how did we get with Purrble and why it's interesting, and then we'll move into the, well, what's the model and how do we explore it later. So for us, the design brief of how did we want to approach this kind of really wide-ranging construct was to say, okay, we should be thinking about innovative delivery mechanisms that work in the moment, in the wild. We should be, come on, computer, be nice. We should be targeting skills development through experiential learning, because a lot of it is skill development, and that seems to be the part that hasn't really been covered, for example, in behavioral change, which is all about reminders and decision support, but not really about that ongoing skills development. And it needs to have a clear path to eventual implementation. We don't have to implement straight away, but it can't be something where you need 200,000 to instrument someone's house to then be able to deliver this intervention you're saying that all NHS should be eventually thinking about. And that kind of means that you have deployable and scalable prototypes, mostly because you want to see what happens. So if you have this lovely, very detailed and rigorous graph of moving from technology innovation to kind of implementation and real world deployments, where we're sitting is reasonably close to the innovation, but we might not be building new technologies. We're thinking about how to apply technologies to interesting places. So the one example that has led out of the UCLIC fellowship is this fluffy little thing that's gone from a fellowship to something that someone produced to loads of things. And the idea there, and this is the example of what would an assumption look like, right? The idea was, what is it if you talk to therapists about supporting child's emotion regulation, what are the things that they believe to be true? And especially in prevention intervention contexts, as well as most of clinical stuff, the idea was that it requires a class didactic learning. It needs to be adult-led, so it's something you tell the child, and then the child kind of needs to go and apply at home, or ideally you train the trainer to go and train the teacher, to tell the parent, to tell the child to breathe next time they're angry, right? So there's lots of little didactic steps on the process. And we had a bunch of papers saying, hey, this is kind of what the literature says. So we said, hey, which of these might not be valid? And we were like, well, all of them. We don't need didacting, probably. It would be really interesting to see, can we do something that's child-oriented and kind of bottom-up? So the whole idea was that my postdoc fellowship started with the question of what would it mean to design child-led and emotion regulation support. So we're challenging all these assumptions that have, not been really thought of because there wasn't a way of doing this just a couple of years ago. So that led to a fellowship, kind of a weird potato had a baby with the owl thing. We've then built these little weird potatoes together with Catherine Isbista. We, each of those potatoes cost like $500 and 4 days of enslaved PhD student time at UC Irvine. No, sorry, Santa Cruz to like be hand sewn. And then we had to go in and disembowel them every 2 days to exchange the lithium batteries, which were really totally safe. And we had to try, and see what happens in the house, right? And then eventually this nonprofit in the US was saying, hey, this is not a bad idea. This seems to work, and poured a reasonable amount of money into turning it into a product that's then ended up on time and is on Amazon and has like 100,000 units sold. So all of a sudden within, well, this is Catherine. If people don't know Catherine, she does amazing, amazing, amazing work. Doesn't matter. If you're interested in the design process, there are 2 papers that talk about it. One is Catherine's recent one that talks about the innovation to implementation, like what was the design process looking like when we went from Peter has a weird idea and thinks Catherine is a PhD student standing next to a poster at Chi to like we now have these things produced. And the CSCW one is the actual design theory part. I have done a couple of places in the talk where I have lots of slides, and I'll skip through them really quickly because I don't have time, but I wanted you to see those slides so that we can get back to them in questions if people have questions. So this is one of those moments where this just says, hey, this is how we would have, how I would have talked to you about designing Purrble had we had another 15 minutes extra. And essentially it said, we've done a fairly basic user-centered design, built something that's essentially really dumb 6-state machine, has a couple of sensors in it. All of the power is infused to it by the humans, by how humans think about it works. There's really deep psychology embedded in how it works and why it works and how it's been designed, what it's supposed to do. So this is kind of a really basic down to biology process that is really interesting. And then there was a very deep thought about how we expect the intervention to actually work. And the whole idea was that you have this drip model. Instead of telling someone what to do, eventually you support little moments of them feeling really sad. So the whole notion of this was an established technique in the families that we talked with was, well, if my child is annoying, cries, or just generally I don't want them around, I just tell them to go and cry in their room on their bed until they feel better, right? Clearly, great emotion regulation strategy. Seems to be fairly much widely distributed within the populations generally, and we were specifically talking with like the lowest 5 percentile populations that we had in Oxford. And the idea here is that what we're giving the child is something that helps them feel better in the moment. It's something that's pull that they can go to. No one hands it to them. It would lose the power if someone handed it to them. They can go to it. It makes them feel better. So that means that they go back to it. It makes them feel better. And you essentially have this positive flywheel of eventually changing things. So a key part of emotion regulation is, do you believe that it's actually something you can control? So one of our initial ideas was, well, let's see if this actually changes people's mindset about, are emotions controllable? Can I do that? Can I find constructive strategies that do not mean that I sit on my bed and cry? Okay, so this is, all of this is relatively recent, from September 2020. So it's 3 years ago. Is the first time when we had factory produced units that did not need all that babysitting. So like, bear with us in terms of the amount of evidence that we were able to collect. Oh yes, I was like, why is there an empty slide? So speaking of the evidence that we were able to collect, I'll just do a really quick kind of a mind map of how we started thinking about these things. So we started with these basic small deployments, 14 families, 11 families, as you would do with HCI, where we deployed it to families for 2 weeks, had a technology probe around it, and really we're looking at the appropriation. How do people engage with it? Does it do something? Do kids ritually burn it or play football with it? Do they actually engage? That seemed to have worked. And it also seemed to work weirdly from Amazon. It seemed like lots of young adults are buying this. So we were like, okay, this sounds interesting. Let's look at what young adults do with it. And again, very much a HCI type study. But at this point, we had factory made units. So we were like, okay, great. This is a new thing that no one's ever done before. But we need just 100 units. I'll email my friends and I'll have the 100 units over and we can just deploy them and they last for 3 months. We'll just do this. So we ran a traditional HCI study, but with slightly larger numbers and a lot of interviewing and understanding, again, appropriation. That seemed to have worked. And it seemed to reduce anxiety, especially around university students. So we started moving towards much more of a clinical perspective. This one is an open trial with 100 people, I think. There are 2 RCTs that we followed up with that are, this is 100, this is 200. Both of those are finished. We're seeing significant, the second one is still analyzed by someone at Stanford because I didn't want to touch the data because it's improper and marginally rude to like analyze your own intervention. So, but it seems like we're actually seeing statistically significant differences in anxiety within an RCT over a single term on university students with nothing else than just handing them that thing and saying, okay, you go next. So that's interesting. Then out of that, it seemed like that young people who also happen to be LGBTQ+ are particularly at risk of emotion dysregulation, that it's more often difficult than just anxiety. It might be self-harm, it might be suicidality, and so on. So we ended up on this little MRC program grant where there's a whole work package working with self-harm clinicians on developing self-harm interventions around Purrble. So what would it mean to build self-harm interventions bottom up around this experience of down-regulation with Purrble that we've had some pilot data on, which is really positive. Open trial, don't trust any of the data, but it seems to have like reduced the self-harming thoughts by substantial percentage, which was more than 20, which the self-harm colleagues are very excited about. And I'm saying, well, we need to do the RCT. And then we also continued with families, right? So we were doing some things around 140 families in the US, looking into how families appropriate these devices. How does this change their social practice in the house? What does the fact that the child has a device like this, does that change the parent-child relationship, which was part of our initial logical model? How can we work around to support this? And that's an additional work that has been taken up by Nikki, one of our PhD students, who's really been looking at how do you build these resources on top of Purrble. And most recently, we ended up with an impact award where Professor Chanturia at IOPPN at King's just also happens to lead this biggest eating disorder clinic, at least that side of London. And now it seems like every single patient in that clinic will receive a Purrble because they ran a pilot on it and seem to really help in a lot of the emotion dysregulation places. So what I want to talk about here is just to show how you kind of, because we had these units and because we could get much further down the line than usually HCI would, how we were able to kind of move from the usual design to larger scale studies which still happen that look at appropriation, look at feasibility, look at the social practice, socio-technical development around it, but then slowly start moving to RCTs and clinical efficacy, which is not what I want to do, but it was important to do and learn how to do so that we could speak with clinicians. And that then paved the way to like proper implementation, because now this could potentially be deployed at the NHS at a range of places. The one thing that I wanted to say that has worked really well for us is that a lot of the time piggybacking on this large scale clinical work means that you actually get to embed a design process on top. So if you're talking about LGBTQ+, psychologists are super excited about just the fact of observing empirically what happens when you hand these little emotion down regulation devices to self-harming youth, right? They don't care about anything else. They just want to see the data. The ones that we work with do, but like it's a really key part. That's the primary outcome for them. For us, it's amazing because we then have 80 young kids or 40 young kids who have these problems, have lived with Purrble for 2 months, and we get to co-design with them while bringing a lot of clinical input in to understand how do you build these cognitive wrappers. Like we now have a starting point. We have a daily experience that is for you to pull. How do we build in that cognitive aspect on top of it beyond the very experiential one? So that notion of RCT is essentially the outcome for the clinicians, but for you, it's really just getting new participants in and starting a new design process has been pretty fun and also very annoying to my clinical colleagues when I'm saying, hey, we're doing the RCT just because we need the participants. Okay, so if we move back to the big picture, we started talking about for emotion regulation, this seems to be a problem. For a lot of places, this seems to be a problem, but specifically for emotion regulation, there's nothing actually that would happen for kids. Notice how then it's like morphed from kids to a lot of other places because it's tapped into a process that is quite general. Let's fix that. Purrble fell out. Great, that was probably luck. So how could you approach, how could you use this approach elsewhere? So what the fellowship was trying to do with the parenting arm, and then a lot of the other arms that we're starting to embed into it, was to look at how could you, now that we're starting to see this process kind of working for young kids and parents, and then anxiety, and then self-harm, and then what else could we be doing this? And do we have to stay within emotion regulation? So this is the third part of the talk, right? It seems like we've hit on a process that seems to be quite applicable across a range of mental health contexts and places, which, you know, there's some really interesting questions to ask, and no one seems to have asked it because it needs a bit of a mindset shift of how you think about an intervention. A psychologist would not think about an intervention as a drip pull. Whenever a child needs an intervention, we give them something that calms them down. That's not necessarily the traditional model of thinking about it. So what could we do, and what is the model that we seem to be pulling out? And this is all a very recent work, something that I've been trying to think about over the last 6 months or so, and we've been working with Sean Munson and Aaron Lyon and David Moore and other people in kind of having these conversations about what is it that we're actually doing. So our current model is that the way how we're trying to approach the psychology and get to a point where we can really take psychological knowledge, strip it off the implementation that psychologists have, and then re-implement it in other ways, is that we really focus on the experiences, on the things that people need to go through throughout that trajectory of the experience, whether they're with the therapist or whether it's part of the manual, or whether it's the thing that you expect them to do, right? The homework and apply and practice and all of those sorts of things. So what are the key aspects of it when thought about participant experience that you need to go through for the psychology impacts to happen? And often psychologists kind of have some gaps, especially towards the end part of the psychoeducation and then people apply it model. But that's interesting. And the ways that we've been approaching it, like the lenses of how to scope these questions, have been about taking a learning sciences approach. So it's very much about what's the learning process. If you assume all of this is skill, if it's not a skill, it's behavioral change that's been not solved, but like I don't believe that any of the things that we do is better than the 30 years of behavioral change and Susan Michie and everyone else. So like if it's behavioral change, defer to behavior change. If it's skills development, then take a learning approach, meaning you really go through the learning process, the cognitive shifts that people need to go through, the challenges, the barriers that might be there that would prevent them from getting kind of that, getting their brains hacked, right? That's what psychology interventions do. They hack your brain so that you see the world differently. So that's interesting. And even clinicians and psychologists don't seem to necessarily have that learning sciences model, because that is not the model of therapist delivery in a classroom situation. The other point is really think about the daily challenges, because that's where a lot of the work has not been focused on, because that was kind of out of purview of what people could really react to. And then the last bit is, if you think about mental health as experiences, and if you get your clinicians to redescribe what the mental health intervention is supposed to do in terms of the experiences, this is now design, right? We know how to design for experiences. So it's not that hard to actually, well, not that hard, famous last words, but it should be plausible to take what we've been given and then decompose, change, reimagine the intervention contents while talking to clinicians, because you kind of want to make sure that you're not doing silly things, but be free to change the surface of it while keeping the back end. So just to show the things that are happening in the group right now, Jess Williams is looking at apart from running the MRC program grant piece, she's working with Eleanor Lee at Oxford, looking at social anxiety and supporting youth in between session support. So we've done a co-design process for, I think, 11 months now. It's going to get embedded in Eleanor's NIHR fellowship, fully implemented, run through an RCT, deployed in NHS. We get access to all the patients and participants. Phoebe Stab, who's a PhD student, amazing PhD student, is looking at interoceptive awareness. How can you support young people or young adults in understanding kind of their relationships with their body? And again, all of these things are just saying, what are the pieces of the world that we're taking and trying to combine? And all of it seems to fit the same matrix. Nikki Theophanpoulou is looking at the parent-child emotion socialization practices in the home and emotion regulation kind of within the parent-child interaction. Melina is looking at design fictions for new parenting interventions. So thinking about what would AI, she comes from Royal College of Art, so what would AI mean as a very new way of thinking about parenting? Sarai, who some of you probably know, is really looking at methodologies that would enable us to capture the daily experiences that parents and children have. She was supposed to build the parenting interventions, but then we learned that none of our clinical partners actually has any idea whatsoever about what's happening in the houses in between the sessions. So we now pivoted to, well, okay, let's spend a year building the methodology so that we can deploy it within the 4 or 5 different major parenting curricula that we have access to, so that we can look at it. And then there's some kind of merging aspects outside where I might support Alex, who does really interesting work on cognitive reappraisal in VR as a postdoc with Alyssa Antle. We're working with Katie around youth engagement with social media, and kind of thinking about how would you apply these same models within the context of youth entering and exiting experiences. There's a wonderful IDC paper that we've had. And then my personal thing that I really want to get to, and I haven't been able to for the last 6 months, is the notion of trickle-up intervention. So we've stumbled upon a mechanism that seems to be really interesting, where simple questions daily could shift parenting behaviors in a similar way as parenting interventions do, but just by being the virtue of 5, 6 questions. It's interesting because it's kind of aligned with just-in-time adaptive interventions. There are some really interesting methodological challenges of how would you run micro RCTs on this. That's why Petr and Susan are on board. James is interested because it's socialization of emotion type of intervention, and that's really what I want to end up doing. So we're nearly getting to the point where I could end and then skip the rest of the slides, and we can talk about discussions or we get further. But what I wanted to say is that the common dilemma that we seem to have across all of these is that if you get too clever with the design, right? If you redesign it too much, you get too far away from the hidden back-end psychology active mechanisms. Your intervention might not be effective, and you kind of need an RCT to test if it is effective, and we don't want to run RCTs because they take forever and they're really expensive and they're kind of clumsy and boring. But if you're not really clever enough, then you're very much staying within the context of, hey, let's take a homework sheet that you have and let's just make it into an interactive PDF rather than a single piece of paper, and then you're missing a lot of the potential change, right? You're not really fundamentally changing stuff. So like an easy way out would be to say, hey, this is exactly what this diagram is supposed to say. You need to sit in the middle of it and combine it, but it doesn't really tell you how, and it's kind of cheating in this way. I think the way that we've been talking about it is one way of approaching it, right? So it's kind of asking you to steps through that process. And I think that articulation is something that has come out of two papers, one of which is already published, and I think some people have kind of read it already, which is a specific thing that's taken me 2 years and everyone else 2 years to write, and talks about what would it mean to design for emotion regulation interventions in this space, and how would we think about that, and what should happen, which I'd love to get feedback on. But then also there's the other work that we've been starting to do with Sean that's been looking at, both Sean and I are doing mental health interventions, but we're doing very different ones, right? Because Sean is looking at implementation science, which is innovating, but kind of around the edges, really important and very crucial edges, but like psychologically edges, and we're doing very different type of innovation. So there's some piece of work that's currently in review that's really trying to think about what does that mean? How do we combine those two perspectives, and where could contributions within HCI kind of sit along that whole line? I'm seeing it being 35. Should we? I'll just do a quick blast so that you don't even see this, and just wrap up with this. See if there are questions, and if people start asking about the model that we have, I can get back to those slides. How does that sound? Yeah, cool. Thank you. That's been it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Questions from the room?
Amazing talk.
Thank you.
So I just have some questions about like your little friend here and how it's
Yeah.
how does it work? So you mentioned that it helps with building skills for emotion regulation, but then is it meant to eventually make children be self-sufficient? You know, like is there a risk or like a fear? Was there ever like they'll become dependent to these, for example, and then they cannot do anything without it?
I think it's a really valid question, and it is the question of, if you think back to that kind of mental health, sorry, the theory of change loop, right? If all we had was that I need support, it makes me feel better, I go back to it, it makes me feel better. If that was the only thing that it does, then that would be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why we were thinking, and I'll go back to that. If my computer, which has been online for like 2 weeks, manages to get there. So that's why we really tried quite hard to have all this stuff, right? So what you're talking about is the in the moment intervention piece, which is saying, well, this helps to provide an in the moment problem resolution for someone. This is just about, this is the theory that goes to, and then there's something about feelings of mastery that you can actually calm down, which seems to be important. But then the whole part of Purrble always was that this should be a family-wide intervention, or at least mindset switch intervention. So if all it did was persuade young kids to shift from the belief that is quite common, that emotion is a weather, you can't really deal with it, you just need to like shelter and then wait for it to pass. If this shifts them to, well, actually I can control the weather, I can make myself feel better, at some points, which it seems to do, that mental shift on its own is really valuable, because there's a bunch of papers talking about, well, the beliefs about self-efficacy around emotions are predictive of reduce depression, reduce anxiety, reduce lots of things. So that alone is interesting. I think what we started saying and what we're, why Nikki's doing her PhD is that this should always have been just a starting point. That is your Trojan horse into a family that provides a token to talk, and that shifts the whole social practice around what it means to think about emotion regulation. Thus, the metaphor of child to Purrble, is similar to parent to child. The notion of, hey, this is handed over to kids. It's lost. We don't know where the mummy is. It seems really anxious. Would you like to take care of it until mummy comes back?
Sure.
That was the whole model, right? So yeah, does that?
Yeah, no.
And like it's something that we were looking for within the empirical data. And actually what seems to happen is people use it until they don't need it anymore. And at that point they hand it, they just stop using it, and that's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Questions?
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Great talk. I don't know, but I think it's audible. I wonder, did you find any situations where a child did not take to, like, was the physicality of this a limitation? I have 2 children. One loves things that look like that. One just never needs them. So, I mean, did you find that itself, that it's something that doesn't apply to everyone? And how would you probably design for those situations?
Yeah, I think it totally doesn't apply to everyone. We have more data now from the youth, because that's easier problem to solve. With youth, you don't have to have the parenting intervention alongside it, and the problems are more pronounced. If you're looking at self-harm or anxiety, like the shifts are happening much faster. More females than males, or self-presenting males, tend to take this up, probably because it's seen as a more appropriate thing to cuddle. There's a reason why we started working with LGBTQ+, because that seemed to have been the population that really reacted to this, and also happens to have loads of additional pressures and stressors and difficulties in life. So my model always was that Purrble is a proof of concept of you can build a mental health intervention bottom up. You can build an intervention by helping people solve their little problems day at a time, and do it in a way that it bundles up into something bigger. Not that this is the one Purrble to rule them all type of model. I think also the problem with things like this is it's exciting to have it. It's been exciting to be part of kind of helping the company make it without getting money for it. But also it means, like any change you suggest, the very valid answer is, okay, and who's going to give us the $1 million to retool the factory line in China? Like, this is now fixed. This is what it is. And that's why we're moving away from Purrble. Purrble should now become the thing, like with Professor Chanturia, just, Kate, here you go, 200 units, go and run it, deploy it across 3 NHS trusts. I'll help you, we might write an NIHR proposal, but this is becoming a a tool that people can use and we can learn from. But it's the cognitive wrappers on top of it that are more interesting, because it's just hard to redesign.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So in a way, what you're describing is using it as a research tool, right? For you, it's a tool to sort of get more insight.
Yeah.
And you said also for you, this is like a starting point. So what's next? So
I think the next bits depend on where you go. So if I'm supposed to put in the extension for the fellowship, so the things that I'll be claiming there is emotion regulation seems to be a thing that we've looked into already, and there's been a couple of slides that I didn't even put at. Claudine Tinsman at Oxford's been looking at using the same framework to put emotion regulation aspects as a coping mechanism for people who are experiencing microaggressions on Twitter and social media, right? So there's now a reasonably established framework that people can use. So that's not a Future Leaders Fellowship material. That just becomes a set of side projects, and ideally I'll help other people start stuff up. So from that perspective, I really want to work with implementation science labs, because we're starting to see these patterns of like, oh, it's not one of these. We've done this already here. It seems to apply very much here. So if we are able to work with people like Aaron or David Moore or people at Oxford who have this massive WHO type of mental health intervention deployments to shift some of the implementation science problems in Africa, for example, where they don't have 30 pounds to deploy on every single child, that will be interesting, right? So it's taking the methodology and applying it to slightly different settings while asking the same questions. The actual research I'm interested in is the parenting interventions, because we haven't, even started solving those or having a proof of case study for them. And I also expect that a lot of the generative AI, as I think I was saying over lunch, will question loads of assumptions about what has and is possible in terms of support for people in the moment. I think, at least like within the current instantiations, taking any of that, the LLMs, to be a capability that behaves like a therapist and on its own gives you a lot of insights, probably doesn't work. Maybe people will make me surprised. But I think the notion of taking LLMs as very specific tools to provide particular steps in the process that might have some hybrid infrastructure with more traditional AI on top that actually makes decision and sends multiple requests for every single thing you return to the participant, for example, to support people in thinking through or problem solving within a situation under a particular mental health construct. That to me sounds really exciting. So I think that's, in terms of innovation, that HCAI model and how would those hybrid systems look like, that's what we'll probably be doing in the context of parenting, just because then it seems to work. It's about who says what to whom. We can capture all the traces. It's all about rephrasing and taking a very specific construct, like be empathic with your child and listen to your child, but saying, okay, I need to be empathic in this situation, which LLMs should be pretty good at that, taking like an example and then figuring out how to do a response within a particular context. So that's
Interesting.
okay. Why am I having this here?
Thanks, Peter. I guess my question is that final trifecta Venn diagram, and how you mention with this example of the LLMs, but there's a very high technological capability, and I guess when a researcher is kind of looking at this and thinking about how much weighting to give to each of these aspects in terms of priority, maybe, like, is that something you've considered, like, that? Okay.
Yeah, maybe. So the way that we're thinking about this now, I'm sorry, this is a very reified and clearly highly detailed depiction. The model is that, how we talked about mental health interventions having a theory of change and kind of talking about the experiences, right? So the idea is that you can decompose an intervention as a system into these little components of, this is a psychoactive element. This is a particular set of experiences that people are supposed to go to. And I think the interesting model there is that practically and theoretically, it doesn't really matter how is that implemented, as long as people have the experiences of the right sort. So I think when we're thinking about applying LLMs, it is about figuring out which components don't exist but should, right? Because people kind of fall off the ladder because they're unable to figure out how to run their behavioral experiment within anxiety or whatever it is that you're trying to focus on. And then identifying within the processes that the therapy would want them to go through, identifying a component that helps address a particular challenge, and then figuring out how to apply a particular capability, which in this case might be an LLM with that hybrid infrastructure up top, and some additional prompting and maybe some psychoeducation on top of it, right? to address that much more specific problem. And I expect that by solving 5, 6, 7, 10 components across 4, 5, 6 different disorders, and then seeing, do you start converging on the same hybrid infrastructure with an LLM, and do you start seeing, reflection or generation of things, or applying a construct to a specific example of a situation being the thing that seems to really help? That's where you would get to, this is kind of a pattern. This is a intermediate construct that we can then take on and think about as Purrble, right? Because then that becomes a thing that's applicable. It's a tool applicable or usable in many, many contexts. Did I answer? Like,
Yeah,
part of the answer, the simple answer is I have no idea. We'll
Yeah.
figure it out. That's why I have a fellowship, or maybe we won't figure it out. But that's how we're thinking about approaching it.
Any more questions? I can ask a question.
Oh, yeah, one behind you. But I'm also happy not to talk for a while.
No, if we have time for one more, I wanted to ask a little bit about the design process. So you mentioned that we sort of glossed over some of the details
Yeah.
on how you landed on this design and the co-designing aspect of it as well. So sort of what were your thoughts going into creating a soft toy? And I guess, yeah, what were some of the decisions that went into this? It's very interesting.
Right. Let me see. I'm sure there are slides about this, but generally the idea was that we tried to, other notes, slides about this. We tried to, the dilemma of like psychology versus innovation, the one that I was talking about. So I think already back then we were trying to address that by identifying this like really specific theory of change and saying, okay, this is going to focus on attention deployment and is going to do something about response modulation like a animal therapy would, right? So those were the mechanisms, the psychology mechanisms that you put in as given into the design brief. And then the design brief was, what would be the kinds of objects and social practices that kids already kind of gravitate to or do, or that would fit into their lives, that would enable us to do attention deployment and response modulation. And that response modulation then is, well, the fluffy toy and animal therapy seems to work. So like that's maybe a way of approaching this. The attention deployment was that notion of you really need to have something that is not visual, that is not auditory, because you can pay attention to a lot of visual stuff. You can pay attention to 3 conversations at a time, even though it's badly done. But the moment you have haptics, you really need to focus on the haptics. That's why all religions have lots of like little rumination beads and so on. So a lot of this is Catherine kind of thinking through the physicality, and a lot of this coming from Catherine's research on fidgeting and the emotion regulation aspects of fidgeting as a way of orienting your body and grounding your body. So yeah, I think the co-design process itself is really about carving out what is the part of the experience design that your users are experts in. And they will not know, in mental health specifically, they will not know how to make themselves better, right? That is part of what you're trying to teach them. So there will always be gaps in what they're able to do. But then they will know so much better than the clinicians what it means to be a child who's been told to do something they can't do, and therefore they sit on their bed and cry and like really aren't that chuffed about it. Right. So what we were designing with the kids was the story, the metaphor, what kind of animal they would like. What does it mean? The things that we were testing with kids was, okay, we have an idea that this vibration model of you're soothing it down and there's a bunch of sensors that you're not told about, but essentially just by holding it, it slowly calms down. How will they react to it? We tested with them, and then we were like, well, is there anything that's annoying to you? And we tested it within mindfulness sessions, and we tested it with kids who were out of traditional schools for throwing chairs around the room, right? So it's been that kind of dance between what can we allow them to design and what do we need to have good ideas about as designers, and how do we capture ideas from all stakeholders and then try to meld them into something that actually makes sense. Thus the, tri diagram that is everywhere. Does it make the, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
One quick question, because I forgot to ask before. So when you did the studies with young people and then university students,
Yeah.
so was it the same form factor, or did you, well, not the form factor actually, but the way that it's implemented, like the intervention, did you change anything?
No, we
about it?
just
So it's exactly the same for.
this is the box that landed in their college inbox.
Yeah.
Nothing else. It was just like, and I think that's the, well, maybe the porters didn't throw it, but like that's the beauty of it, right? You just hand over a physical thing and then you're done. And I mean, yes, we had some single session intervention that I didn't even talk about, and then we got Jessica involved with and James involved with designing around trying to shape the experience that people have based on all the experiences that the previous cohort of RCT people have had, which I think is a separate thing. But the actual intervention and what seems to really have made the difference, to best of our knowledge, knowing that the RCT data isn't fully analyzed and all of that, but has been the fact that they just had this, and that people are talking about, this grounds me, this stops rumination, right? So it stops me spiraling off into a dark place. It gets my mind back to a place where I can apply the techniques that therapists gave me. It's those sorts of things that are really about like being there and being grounded and being focused and down-regulating in particular ways. And it's fascinating, right? That the same thing that's been designed for 6-year-olds, like, yes, they would like it slightly smaller and they don't take it into a library because like people will laugh at me, and all of those things are obvious. Like traditional UX problems, you could think about, can I make it much smaller? Can I make it into a phone case, right? You could have this around your phone. It could take up a lot of the capabilities that your phone has. Interesting interaction design question is, well, would it lose the power because this has now become an object imbued with experiences and emotions and things? Now this will become a thing that's on top of something else, right? But that's not, it's super interesting, but it's not fundamentally different, right? You've now turned it from we have a homework sheet and now we're going to do slightly different homework sheet because these people like punk.
Yeah.
So that's why we didn't do it, because I'm like, I have different things that are exciting.
So thank you so much for coming and presenting your research to us today. Round of applause for Peter.
And also just to say, all of that applause should also go to all these people that are coming. This is
slide again.
This is, yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Those. And all the collaborators that didn't even fit.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for coming today to the research seminar. It's the first in person, I guess it's what I should have said at the start. We had one last week as well. It was online. I can't for the life of me remember when the next seminar is or who it is, but you'll get an email about that. We're not holding them every Wednesday. We're holding them as needed. But thank you so much for your attendance and questions. Feel free to come up and interact with one of the Purrbles and ask more questions. And
You're joking, but I'm not. So like these, if you want them, they can now live at UCL.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much.
So a Purrble costs as much as 11 minutes of clinician time. So like, you can just hand them out, right? Cool. Can I take this thing?